This is Beginner's Guide to ACC for Mental Injury for Providers Part 2. And I'll be your host, Melissa Porritt, and joined today by Penny Cockett-Lowe on our chat. Okay, so before we begin to go into our presentation proper, we'll start with our ACC karakia. So whaia, whaia, whaia te tika, whaia te pono, whaia te aroha. Mo te oranga tangata, kia puta ki te whae ao, ki te ao marama, haumie, huie, taikie. So our ACC karakia is around striving to do what is right, undertaking to act justly, being considerate of everybody so that it may improve the lives of all. Okay. And these are the topics that we'll be covering today, looking at assessing mental injury, taking a little bit of time to talk around what our expectations are of you as providers, and covering off some tips and take-home messages, and also how to contact us. So I should probably introduce myself again very briefly. As I said, I'm Melissa Porritt. I'm a clinical psychologist by training and have been with ACC primarily as a psychology advisor for almost 10 years, and then have recently moved into the clinical advice manager role. And my colleague Penny, who is on the monitoring the chat today, is likewise a clinical psychologist and clinical advice manager here at ACC. Okay. So we will be, as I say, monitoring that chat. So if any questions do come up, please feel free to pop those in. Okay. So let's look at assessing mental injury. This slide here is really just giving us a nice little synopsis of the sorts of information that ACC needs, our golden thread that we like to see coming through in our assessments. And in the slides that follow, we'll talk specifically around what the purpose is of our assessments, why we ask for the information that we do, and how we use that to help clients in their journey with ACC. Okay. So, here we go. These are the sections that we'll be speaking about in a bit more detail as we run through. So first off, what's really important for us here at ACC is for our providers and assessors to have an understanding that the primary audience is non-clinical. The majority of our recovery team members, or RTMs, are lay people. So these are people who will come from a background in retail or working in call centres. They don't have a depth of clinical understanding, and so it's really important when you're doing your assessments to make sure that you tailor the work, tailor the way that you write to target that. So, sorry, just give me a moment to bring up my notes. Okay. Okay. Just check that there's nothing else I needed to say on that. Okay. So, and you'll see the second heading there is logical flow. So again, it's probably report writing 101, but it's really crucial, given that you're writing for lay people effectively, that there is a logical flow to your report. And if you use the report templates that ACC provides, that should help and mean that we don't have any surprises when we get to the diagnostic section, for instance. And there should be no new information covered off in the formulation, your clinical formulation, or at the very end of the report. Okay. So going now to our next slide, which is fit for purpose. Okay. So now that you have a little bit of a better understanding about the audience, let's think about the purpose, or the why we do what we do. There are two key purposes of a mental injury assessment. Firstly, to establish whether or not there's a material link between the diagnosed conditions and the physical injury or the Schedule 3 event, and also to give guidance on the client's treatment needs for any given diagnosis. So when we talk about a report being fit for purpose, we're talking about a report which translates the assessment knowledge in your head down onto paper in such a way that a layperson can understand it, and in a way that's supported by examples and by collateral information. So a fit for purpose report is one that really walks us through your clinical reasoning and thought processes, one that covers off any loose ends, speaks to any gaps or any obvious differential diagnoses. The one thing that we're not talking about with a fit for purpose report is about being an expert witness. So this isn't about your years of experience or your clinical background or your qualifications. Fit for purpose is really all about how well you write and how well you can convey your clinical reasoning. Okay, so jump to the next slide. Tangible examples. So this is tied in with that concept of using plain English and writing in a way that your audience will be able to relate to. The reason that we ask you to do this is so that the recovery team member, having read your report, will be able to understand what the client is going through on a day-to-day basis. And we want the RTM to have a really good understanding about that, because that then helps them get a sense of what sort of things the clients are going to need support with as part of their rehabilitation. And it also means that the recovery team member can then know what they're looking for in terms of an appropriately pitched treatment plan, and it gives them some really realistic expectations around timeframes for rehabilitation for that client. Yeah, so effectively when we talk about tangible examples, we're asking you to go beyond using just generic terms of depression, dissociation, panic, and to try and paint a picture of what it's like to stand in that client's shoes. And expanding on those differences is what really lifts that assessment from that cookie cutter type approach to something that's really useful and meaningful for that particular client. So for instance, if you wanted to say that Melissa suffers from dissociative episodes, which would be an appropriate use of a psychological term, you might want to then follow that up with, what does that actually mean? So if Melissa suffers severe dissociative episodes, they cause her to lose track of time, upwards of 30 minutes at a time, 3 to 4 times a day, and to have no memory of her actions over those times. And that then explains to the RTM what dissociation actually means for that particular client. And then once you've described what that issue looks like in layman's terms, you're really going to need to speak to what the impact of those symptoms are, because they may be hearing that and thinking, well, I daydream all the time, I drift off. So hitting home what that actually means in terms of that impact on that person's life is crucial. So you might want to follow that up with something like this impacts on her ability to work productively. Her employer has questioned her commitment to her job. Her relationship with her family is strained because they perceive her to be neglectful, etc. So again, really taking your knowledge of that client's individual circumstances and helping that recovery team member see what it's like to be in that person's shoes. Okay, right. And yeah, I guess for many of us, we'll be familiar with assessing PTSD. Um, I'm sure if you take 10 clients with PTSD, they may all have nightmares, avoidance, and hypervigilance, for instance, but no two of them are going to be the same. They'll be hypervigilant to different things and avoidant of different things. So yeah, really, really honing in on those individual differences makes a huge impact for our reports. Okay, so which brings us now, and I can find my mouse, up to have the importance of good collateral information. So for those of you who were in the presentation by Penny Cockett-Lowe a couple of weeks ago, Penny spoke about how hard it is to determine causation and the need to look at it from many different angles. So going beyond just client self-report and building in any information that you can get from medical records or from liaison with the lead provider, perhaps the GP or any significant others in the client's life. Okay. And that really just helps to ensure that that report is balanced, holistic and credible. Okay. Jump to the next slide. Eventually, yes, sorry, I'm skipping ahead here. So detailed diagnoses. Right. It's always really important to expand on what I mentioned earlier about logical flow and having a good description of the presenting problems, to also have some detailed diagnoses in a report. And when we're reviewing reports as psychology advisors, we don't want to arrive at the diagnosis section and think, where did that come from? And then have to scroll back through the report looking for sort of hints or clues about how you've arrived at a given diagnosis. I mean, the general rule of thumb is if a person has a condition that's severe enough to warrant diagnosis, it's also warrants a really detailed description in the presenting problems section. And, this is actually one of the key reasons why a psychology advisor or a PA may come back to an assessor, which is also a good point to remind you that it's not about you personally or professionally or about being an expert witness. It's really just about the ability to walk us through the rationale. And a lot of that can be preempted by giving a really detailed reasoning. Okay. So this brings us to our next topic of validity and reliability. Now, this is something that a lot of people feel a little bit nervous about discussing. There can be a sense sometimes that people are putting themselves at risk of complaint or being perceived as non-client centric to, touch on issues around validity. So I'll tell you what our expectations are and talk you through some examples to help put some context around this. So effectively, we're not seeking to demonize clients at all. This is really about acknowledging that human beings are very complex and that there are lots of things that shape our view of the world and the way we respond. It's also about acknowledging that sometimes people have competing motivations in terms of reporting their symptoms, either consciously or subconsciously. And that can be for a huge variety of reasons: personality, culture, past experiences with healthcare providers. I'm sure many of us will be familiar with clients who may have overstated symptoms in order to get help, and equally other clients who, understate in order to avoid a particular diagnosis or being perceived in a particular way. Reporting can also be influenced by a client's level of insight, or there could be more serious perceptual issues, or issues with reality testing. And of course, something that I know I personally have seen a number of times where there are apparent inconsistencies in reporting, which then turn out to actually be a byproduct of a mistake having been made in an earlier report and then just repeated over time. So as clinicians, we need you, and assessors, we need you to be alert to the possibility of any one of those things or more of those things happening for any given client, and to just keep a mindful eye on what that may mean for the way in which the client presents. Okay. We may never get to the bottom of things, but if people are able to note those in an impartial manner, it means that we can factor in what that might mean for the client's treatment or rehabilitation. Okay. Which brings us almost to the end of our points on good assessment. Okay. So holistic, yeah, as the name would suggest, please make sure that you're considering all areas of functioning, all diagnoses and explanations for possible symptoms. So, for instance, we know that trauma is something that is really quite common in the mental injury space, but it's certainly not the only disorder that we see. And I think there can be a bit of a tendency at times for people to get almost a bit of tunnel vision around trauma being the only condition that they look out for. So do just keep your mind open to the possibility of other disorders as well. And remembering that we need comment on any pre-existing conditions as well, and any unrelated diagnoses to try and help us understand, yeah, the client in their entirety. Okay. Oh, and also a note, I've been asked to remind people about depression, just to remember that this is a fairly ubiquitous diagnosis. So if you're going to put it forward as a mental injury, we really do need to have a tight formulation to support that. Okay. And an example of this would be the issue that we see quite commonly, where there's an overlap between depression and PTSD. Um, and there's no doubt that these disorders do co-occur very often in clients. And there's also a reasonable degree of symptom overlap. But I'm sure you also know too that we can't double dip on symptoms, i.e., the same symptoms can't be counted twice towards two separate diagnoses. So what that means for you when you're writing the report is that we do need you to, if you want to get both of those conditions over the line, so to speak, as mental injuries, is to make sure that when you write up your report, you're really clear about which symptoms go with which diagnoses, in order to demonstrate that both disorders can be supported. Okay, right. And informing treatment. Now, you might have picked up as I've been talking that ACC is really looking for functional examples to support the reporting of symptoms and diagnoses. And, it goes without saying that once we have a clear understanding of what the client's difficulties are, we then know where the client's treatment needs lie and what modalities might be most useful, who needs to be involved, and what the rehabilitation timeframes might look like. So the assessment reports that you provide us give us a really good baseline to go on. Okay. And I think that now brings us to questions. So,
Yes, kia ora, Melissa, and thank you. Just been monitoring the chat here, and the first question that we have is around some clients prefer pronouns of they and them, and I've struggled with a report recently because they already has a meaning when writing reports, writing something like they ran after them and attacked them again. Is there any advice that you can provide on the use of pronouns?
yes, I think firstly, wherever possible, it's probably more helpful to use the client's name if the client's comfortable for you to do that. But in those instances where that doesn't sit well in the writing of the report, the assessor might like to consider perhaps using capital letters for the they and them when it refers to the client, as opposed to the general use of they and them in the report, if that makes sense to distinguish that.
And Mel, we've had a question here. What circumstances, in which circumstances do you prefer that a psychiatrist completes a supported assessment report rather than a psychologist or a counsellor?
Mm. Well, we tend to look at each case on its merits, but generally speaking, if there are if there's a significant psychiatric history or any hint of bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, any of the major mental health uh, disorders, that would be a good point at which we would be leaning more towards a psychiatrist than a counsellor or a psychologist. But I think also if there are issues around medication or multiple medical comorbidities, again, that would be a reason for leaning more to a psychiatrist than a counsellor, for instance. And if there are any doubts, that would be a good time to reach out ahead of the assessment and maybe discuss that with a psychology advisor, and we can look into the specifics of each case as it's presented.
And I guess it's also worth considering whether or not an assessment of incapacity is required. And so, for example, if somebody's also
Absolutely.
making a claim for work-related compensation.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good point. So I think yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Were there any more questions that had come through at this point, or are we safe to move on?
Safe to move on. Thanks,
Safe to move
Melissa.
on. Awesome. Okay. So that brings us to our next section on our expectations of providers and assessors. Okay. So the key point that I'd like to convey today is around the assessor's duty of care towards clients in terms of managing safety risks, and that's risks to themselves and also risks to others, including the risk of harm being done to children or vulnerable people, even if though the children are not your clients or they're not the children of your client. Okay. So these expectations are consistent with what's expected of us by our professional bodies and our respective codes of conduct. And as an assessor and a provider, given that you're gathering that information firsthand, you are, ethically and legally obliged to act on that information to ensure the safety of all parties. And really, I guess when we're talking about our expectations, we need to convey that it's not sufficient for you to pass that information on to ACC and hope that we will address the issues. That responsibility sits with you specifically as providers. Um, and it's also important to note too that if you come across any safety issues that do need intervention, please document this either in the assessment report itself or in an email to the recovery team member. And that just closes the loop at our end so that if we later on spot something, we can look back and see, oh, that's been dealt with. Okay. So most of our assessors are, I must say, really good when it comes to dealing with issues of self-harm, suicidal ideation or intent. Most of us are really clear on what our obligations are there. The areas that we as psychology advisors see posing more of a challenge for assessors would be around the risk of harm to others, including the risk of harm to children. So I'm probably preaching to the converted here in this audience, but nevertheless, our PA team would probably have to reach out on at least a monthly basis to an assessor somewhere in the country to either prompting them to follow up on their duty of care or to check that that was done because it hasn't been documented anywhere on our system. So I'll give you some real life instances that I've personally had to follow up on. And this would include, in the first case, a claim where we had a client who was on electronically monitored bail, and that was as a consequence of him having repeatedly breached protection orders against his ex-wife. And he had a significant history of violence towards that ex-wife, which is why the protection orders were in place in the first instance. And this client had a mental injury assessment, and several times over the course of that assessment, he made it very clear to the assessor that he intended to kill his ex-wife and her new partner as soon as the ankle bracelet was removed. And he outlined the means, the method, and a motive. He had access to the means, and as I've mentioned, a substantial history of violent offending towards this woman. So for most of us, that should be ringing alarm bells, but in that case, it did actually require quite a bit of follow-up for the assessor to help the assessor see that they had a duty of care towards this person's ex-wife, given the statements that the client was making. And I'm not sure exactly where that landed in the end, but the outcome was that that person's probation officer was contacted, and that risk was appropriately disclosed to them, and they would have escalated that up. So that's one instance of managing the risk to others. And another instance that sprang to mind when I was writing up this presentation was a claim where we had a young woman in her mid-20s. She was living with her mother and stepfather, and it was some very gnarly circumstances where the mother had married this man after he was released from having served a significant prison sentence for violently sexually offending against that young woman when she was a child. And the mother had never believed the child, despite the court case and the outcome of that. So leaving all of that aside, there was no risk to that young woman herself at the time of the assessment. But one thing that was uncovered over the course of the supported assessment was that she had an older sister, and the older sister and her two young girls had actually moved in or moved back home with the mother and stepfather, which then, you know, then puts us in a position of knowing now that we've got two young girls who were actually around the same age that the client was when she was abused, and they're living in a home with a convicted child sex offender and a grandmother who is not going to be is unlikely to form any sort of protective factor there. And, that's just, although those children weren't part of the assessment per se, that's not the sort of information that we can just walk past. So again, that involved quite a bit of reaching out to the assessor and helping them to understand that they did actually have an obligation under the Vulnerable Peoples Act to escalate that appropriately to Oranga Tamariki. Okay, so in a nutshell, we expect you to think holistically about the safety of your clients and also of others, and we expect you to take steps to manage those risks as they come up, and also to keep us informed about what steps you've taken. So, one. So we'll jump now to the next slide and then take some questions around safety, because I know this is quite a big topic. So the next thing to cover would be around creating a safe space. I mean, we understand that having a mental injury assessment, whether it's for a physical injury or a sensitive claim or work-related, it's an inherently stressful process for the client, and there's no getting away from that. But there are things that we can do to mitigate the distress of the process and to create a safe space. So being organised, making sure that everything runs smoothly, that everyone knows where they need to be, that there's enough time to get there, and that you're not rushing, and to be able to be present, mentally present for the client. And that preparedness can also involve determining what your client's cultural needs are ahead of the assessment. Okay. So alongside this, part of the preparedness would also involve knowing a bit more about your client, perhaps before you even meet them. So ideally, speaking with the lead provider, if they have one, reading the person's medical notes. I know personally I like to reach out to clients before I have an assessment, just to do an initial introduction, confirm appointment times, and really try and put a bit of a human face to the process. And I think one of the key things that we receive negative feedback on from clients is around that sense of feeling rushed during the assessment. So, you know, do make sure that there's wriggle room in your schedule if you might need to provide additional assessment sessions if you haven't managed to cover everything in that first session. Okay. Yeah. And just around the delivery of core findings and managing expectations, please be aware if you've not been able to obtain any collateral information and you're waiting on collateral information, be mindful when delivering your findings of this or your tentative findings of the assessment to the client that this may change, and just being careful to not set people up for potential disappointment until you've really got all our ducks in a row and until you can say that you've taken a really careful holistic overview of that assessment process. Okay, so I will pause there and go to questions.
We had a question here around notes, requesting notes, and obviously during COVID, it was difficult to get notes, and providers got communications from ACC asking them or informing them that they were unable to get notes. So what is our position on that now?
I think at the moment, it's really important to have a think about why you're asking for the information that you're asking for, to know that that it will be something of use rather than just say the past 10 years or a whole lifetime's worth of medical notes. But we are once again requesting GP notes. And are you able, can I put a little bit of that back to you, Penny? It's a bit more active in that space at the moment.
So I think we are still requiring collateral information in the form of medical records where they are necessary and important and appropriate. So this will speak particularly to cases where we know that there is a pre-existing history of mental health concerns or previous treatment. If the person comes and there's no suspicion of any other comorbidities, medical or mental health, or a pre-existing history, then it becomes less important to get those pre-existing medical notes.
Sure.
Or medical notes on previous conditions. Obviously, this is sometimes a judgment call because clients don't always disclose everything. But we are conscious of the difficulty of getting notes and the necessity sometimes of going ahead without them. But we do ask you to apply your judgment and discretion. And if you do feel that those are important to get, please do go ahead and try and get them. There's different ways that you can do that too. ACC obviously can request those notes and get them to you, but it does take longer, mainly because of ACC's own privacy checks. There's quite a lot of processes that we need to go through when we hold records, and it includes our staff checking the record several times and redacting and removing, unnecessary information. It can take quite a long time. Sometimes providers actually find it quicker to either approach the holder of the medical records, whether it's a DHB or a GP themselves, because then, of course, they don't have to go through the ACC machinery. And it's not actually necessary in all instances for ACC to hold that information. And sometimes clients can request their own medical information, and that is often quicker again, because obviously they're able to do so without any sort of permission signed forms or anything like that. They can just request those and get those. So there are ways of getting around it, and of course your clinical judgment is the most important thing there. If you choose not to get records or you're unable to get records, please do put that in your report, because obviously if there are questions, then those are already answered.
Perfect. Okay, it's a really comprehensive answer, Penny. Thank you.
Melissa, we just also have one more question. Does ACC need to be informed or for contacting an outside agency, i.e. would there otherwise be repercussions to disclosing information that is private? And I believe this came up in the instance of risk to selves and risk to others on a previous slide, and disclosing that.
Right. No, I think as you know, as the lead or as the assessor, as a registered health provider, if you hold first-hand information that speaks to imminent risk to either the client or another person, then you are obligated to act appropriately with that information and take whatever steps necessary to maintain the safety of everybody involved. And that's not something that you need to seek ACC's approval to do. That's just something that, you know, your own professional obligation is to, yeah, as I say, to handle that most appropriately. And in most instances, wouldn't necessarily, ACC would not be the first people you would call. You may want to inform you. It would be very helpful if you could inform us at the end once you have escalated it appropriately, whether that's just a quick email to the recovery team member, for instance, to say during the assessment process I had significant concerns about risk, therefore I discussed this with the lead provider and we made a referral to the mental health team, for instance. That would be sufficient for ACC purposes. It just means that we can then rest assured that you've seen the risk and you've responded to it. Okay, that's, yeah, I think, does that answer that? Hopefully that answers that sufficiently. Okay. All right, shall we jump to our top tips and take home messages? So we're onto the home straight now of the assessment. Okay. So in terms of getting a good outcome for everyone, 4 core points around knowing your role, the fact that ACC doesn't cover all mental illnesses. We only cover mental injuries, with a mental injury being specifically a mental illness that has arisen as a result of a condition that ACC can cover, be that a specific type of Schedule 3 events or physical injuries. And we also rely on you to give us a neutral and balanced diagnosis, and equally balanced causal formulations and comprehensive treatment plans. So the second point would be being client-centric. As we just spoke about, we know that assessments can be really traumatizing for clients, and you can help best by being prepared, by not asking for unnecessary detail, and by providing some clear feedback to clients and to the lead providers. Being prepared, having all the medical records, as Penny just spoke to before, if it's possible to obtain those, and ideally knowing what's in them before you meet the client so that you can plan your assessment appropriately. And if medical records aren't readily available, thinking more broadly about what other sources of collateral information you can collect. Okay. And helpfulness. This is a big one for us. Making practical recommendations, knowing what options are available in your local area through your supplier or just within the community. And if you don't know, being able to say that too. Okay. So communication, again, best tip for a great outcome is to communicate well and to communicate often. If there's a delay in getting notes, or if there's some difficulty engaging with the client, or other circumstances such as illness, for instance, please keep ACC posted and keep the lead provider posted too. If, for instance, you realise partway through the initial assessment that maybe this would have been better off, better managed by a referral to a psychiatrist, communicate that early. Don't wait until the end of the assessment process and then make that your first recommendation. Equally, if there are any safety issues, again, please keep us posted. If you find that you're going to need more time, again, we realise that the people we're dealing with are very vulnerable. They're people whose resilience may be at a low ebb. They can't always be fitted into neat little boxes, and we're open to working flexibly with our providers and assessors, but we do need you to communicate to us clearly and early what those needs are for any given client. Okay. Okay. So this brings us now to looking at services for clients. So this slide is really prefaced with a number of caveats. ACC has a number of different contracts under which people may be able to access support depending on the types of injury they have. So people who have an accepted physical claim will be entitled to different sorts of supports as opposed to people who have an accepted sensitive claim. And the types of contracts that the providers work under will also determine what a client can access. And we have a number of different contracts. We have the pain services contract, the neuropsychological services contract, the integrated services for sensitive claims contract, the psychological services contract, and counselling contracts as well. They all have their own nuances. And so it's really the onus is on you as assessors and providers to know the ins and outs of which contracts you are working under and what the limitations are for those. I won't try and cover them all today because I'll be here half the afternoon. So the availability of services is also affected by supply and geographical location. So for instance, some sensitive claimants may be able to attend group yoga sessions because that's what's available in their area. And for others, that just may not be an option due to issues of supply. So yeah, in other instances, we may have a supplier in a particular area, but then again, if there's a 9-month wait list, again, that might be something that you need to factor into treatment recommendations. So managing client expectations is really crucial. Please don't set people up for disappointment by recommending services that aren't in their area or that aren't available under their contract. Yeah. Okay. And so we have a little list here on the slide of the things that we can do for most clients, including individual therapy, group therapy, particularly in sensitive claims, adjunctive support. So that might be, for instance, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's something that we see used as an adjunctive support quite often in sensitive claims, whereby a person may be having a particular type of counselling and then the lead provider determines that they'd actually benefit from some sessions of EMDR, and so that can then be used alongside the counselling, provided that it comes out of the total amount of sessions that are allocated for the client. We also offer family and whānau sessions and rongoa, which I know is not a psychological treatment, obviously, but rongoa Māori is a service that's now available to all clients who have accepted ACC claims. Okay, and we can put some links to that in this slide pack. Okay. So once again, skip up, we'll go to our next slide, which brings us to our questions.
Yes, there's one question here. What steps is ACC taking towards using strengths-based assessment, so non-diagnostic, non-pathologizing models of assessment?
In short, the answer would be none, because we do need the system that we work within really does need diagnoses to help us help access our services. But certainly in terms of a strength-based assessment, I don't see that that's mutually exclusive with the ACC process. I think you can still do work in a strengths-based way, including a strengths-based assessment with the client, whilst also then submitting a report that meets the needs of ACC. And Penny, did you want to speak a bit more about that? Actually, I know that's something you're quite strong on, the need for diagnoses. Yeah.
Well, yes, I think we all share an understanding that a diagnosis is really a shortcut understanding, with the purpose of using a shared language and facilitating access to services. And in a system which is essentially, we're an insurance company, and like other insurance companies or other medical settings do require some sort of shared understanding, codes, labels for the purposes of providing access to certain services and so on. But certainly that's not how we see people, and it's certainly not how providers see people, and it's not how people see themselves. So that is separate, and that is very, very important to recognize. And as providers, I think you have an enormous role in that. So your diagnosis is not who you are. The read code on the ACC claim is not who you are. And the assessment does provide an opportunity to explore protective factors, to explore strengths as part of the way forward in a treatment pathway. So some of those sort of pathologizing elements are unfortunately necessary for the mechanics and the machinations of this process that we're in, which is determined by legislation, which isn't very friendly and not very people-oriented. But I think providers have an enormous role to play in bringing the human element to their work in assessment, in treatment. Every intervention, every intervention is an opportunity to work with the mana of the person you have in front of you, and there's no reason you can't do that. Yeah.
Cool. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. Okay. Did we have any more, Ruby, or shall we move to the next?
Yeah,
to
we do. We
contact?
do have a few more questions here, Melissa, which I think you've already touched on. But is rongoa Māori available for all clients or just Māori?
For all clients. That's right.
Thank you. And also just another question around the yoga sessions, and if this is available for ACC to fund. I understand that's more in the context of trauma-informed yoga therapy. We have group-based therapies that are available in that sort of setting, but we understand it also is occurring in some individual circumstances, individual therapy as well. Is that correct?
I think that's where the lead provider is the person who delivers that trauma-informed yoga. Yeah, I mean, we take a high trust approach with our providers. We don't regulate what therapy per se they use with the clients. It's more about the fact that the provider themselves is registered with ACC, having met the various criteria. And if a lead provider is skilled in delivering trauma-informed yoga and they would like to use some of their allocated sessions to do that one-on-one with their client, then that's fine. We'll leave that to their judgment. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I've just got one final question here. What is the difference between mental injury and mental illness? I think it was just referenced on a couple slides back.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a really, really fundamental to understand if you're doing assessments for ACC. So when we talk about mental illness, we're talking about all forms of mental illness, really, and that's what we'd call a real world term. Mental injury, by contrast, is a term that was coined by ACC to speak specifically to the forms of any type of mental illness that has arisen as a consequence of certain types of Schedule 3 events or as a consequence of covered physical injuries. Yeah, or as we've seen in the previous assessments, previous seminar, work-related events as well.
A slight amendment there. The coin was termed by medico-legal context. So in New Zealand, it's ACC, but internationally, you'll find it in other insurance and medical legal contexts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
And I think I have a question for Ruby, which is, what other services can be offered for sensitive claim clients who are single parents with children who also get problems?
Thanks, Penny. Sorry, just put myself on mute there. Yeah, really great question. And I guess it's about defining ACC's role and what we cover in our responsibility to deliver rehabilitation and support for clients who have a covered personal injury. So we know obviously that there may be instances that people may need some assistance to support the children or to support things that are happening in the home environment or access to additional support. But it does really come down to the injury related need and what that support is for that person. So another question that's just come through around travel assistance and is that available for clients to access, or is childcare available to access so people can go to their sessions? It's all about what that injury related need is. But also we do encourage, if you feel as though clients and their children or their whānau or any other members that are important to them require some assistance, just think about what's ACC's role. Do they believe, or do you believe they need access that is non-ACC related, so a referral to a GP or privately funded counselling sessions? If they have suffered sexual abuse and assault themselves, we encourage you to lodge a claim or refer them to the GP so their GP can lodge a claim, so that they can access their own separate counselling there as well, or any other form of personal injury, which Melissa has also referenced. So it is about the injury related need for the client, but we also know sometimes that people may need additional support that can help recovery rehabilitation to progress, and it's just about exploring that with ACC and what that can actually look like. Hopefully that answers that one.
Fantastic. Very comprehensive answers. Thanks, Ruby and Penny. Okay. So this brings us to our final section around how to contact us. Okay. So you'll see here up on the screen we've got two separate psychology advisor hotlines, one for sensitive claims, one for physical injury. And we would encourage you to contact our PA hotlines whenever you have a question about a complex situation. Sometimes a quick discussion with one of our PAs can really help smooth that and progress your assessment and treatment work much faster. But please do bear in mind that this isn't a substitute for professional supervision, and any contractual queries really need to go via your supplier. Okay. And we do occasionally get queries around how do we contact people with a dedicated recovery partner or versus people on the assisted team. So we've got these contact details up for you here. And if you haven't signed up to our newsletter, the mentalhealth@acc.co.nz is the place to go to sign up for that. And from here on, yeah, thank you for joining us today. We're really keen to make sure that our future webinars are engaging, helpful and informative for you and other healthcare providers. And we will send you out a survey with this link today as well. So please do reach out, take the time and give us your feedback. We're extremely grateful. And just to close off today, we will finish with our ACC karakia. So whaia te tika, whaia te pono, whaia te aroha. Mō te oranga tangata, kia puta ki te whae ao, ki te ao marama, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.